Welcome, dear listeners, to the English Globe. We're so happy to have you here with us today. Whether you are listening from home, your classroom, your office, or even while walking outside, we thank you for spending your time with us. I'm Adam, and together with Julia, we're going to take you on a deep journey through one of the most important and dramatic periods in modern history, the Cold War.
That's right, Adam. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia, and we're very excited to explore this topic with you. The Cold War shaped the world we live in today. It changed politics, technology, culture, and even the way people thought about peace and power. But don't worry, We'll explain everything in simple English so you can both learn history and improve your English skills at the same time.
Before we start, dear listeners, we kindly ask you to take just a moment to support the English Globe. Please like this video if you find it helpful, and subscribe to our channel for more educational podcasts like this one. Your support really helps us grow and reach more English learners around the world. And we'd love to know, where are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below and share your thoughts about today's topic.
Yes, we always enjoy reading your comments. They help us understand what you want to learn next. So please take a few seconds to introduce yourself and tell us your opinion about this episode. Now, let's begin our journey into a time when the world was not at peace, but also not in open war. A time full of fear, secrets, and power struggles.
The Cold War was not like other wars. There were no big battles between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was a war of ideas, influence, and control. Two superpowers, both winners of World War II, suddenly became rivals, each trying to shape the future of the world according to their beliefs. One side represented capitalism and democracy, while the other stood for communism and state control.
Exactly. To understand why the Cold War matters, we have to look at how it began. After World War II ended in 1945, the world hoped for peace. Millions of people had died, and countries were destroyed. But instead of unity, a new kind of conflict began. One without direct fighting, but filled with fear, mistrust, and competition in almost every part of life.
This period is called Cold because it wasn't fought with bombs and armies between the two superpowers, but through politics, propaganda, and influence. The United States and the Soviet Union both tried to show that their system was the best way to live. They competed to control other countries, to build the most powerful weapons, and to win people's minds and hearts.
Imagine living in a world divided into two sides, one led by America and the other by the Soviet Union. People in many countries felt like they had to choose which side to follow. There was fear of nuclear war, but also a race for progress in science, technology, and even space exploration. The Cold War shaped how people thought about safety, freedom, and the future itself.
For English learners, studying the Cold War is very useful because it helps you understand many modern topics: global politics, international relations, and the way countries make decisions. The words and expressions used during that time, like Iron Curtain, arms race, superpowers, and nuclear deterrence, are still used in news and political discussions today.
That's a great point. The Cold War also reminds us how powerful communication and ideas can be. It shows us that sometimes wars are not fought with soldiers, but with words, media, and influence. Understanding this history helps us see why cooperation and dialogue are so important in today's world. It teaches us that peace is not something we can take for granted. It must be protected and valued.
The world after World War II was full of hope and fear at the same time. On one side, there was the dream of building a peaceful, democratic future. On the other side, there was the promise of equality under communism. Both sides wanted to rebuild the world, but they didn't trust each other. Their differences created a long, invisible conflict that lasted for more than 40 years.
During those years, the Cold War touched every part of life. from politics and education to art, sports, and even entertainment. Movies, books, and music reflected the tension between East and West. Children learned about the possibility of nuclear war at school. Scientists worked to create new technologies, sometimes for progress and sometimes for power. It was a time of fear, but also of discovery and innovation.
In this podcast, we'll go step by step through that history. We'll explain how the Cold War started, what events defined it, and how it finally ended. You'll hear about the Berlin Wall, the arms race, the space race, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and the fall of the Soviet Union. Each part will help you understand how this period changed the world and how it still influences us today.
And don't worry, you don't need to be a historian to enjoy this. We'll keep the language clear and simple, with short explanations of difficult words. You'll learn English naturally by listening to real conversations about interesting topics. So if you're studying for IELTS, TOEFL, or just want to improve your speaking and listening, this podcast will help you.
So, dear listeners, as we begin this long journey through history, remember that learning English is not only about words and grammar. It's about understanding the world and how it became what it is today. The Cold War is a perfect example of how ideas can shape history and how communication, or the lack of it, can change the destiny of nations.
Exactly, Adam. So, let's open the first chapter of this historical story. Let's go back to the end of World War II, when two great powers stood side by side as allies, and soon after became the world's biggest rivals. What happened between them? How did friendship turn into mistrust? And why did their conflict last so long without a single direct battle between them?
That's what we'll explore in the next section. We'll look at how the alliance between America and the Soviet Union broke apart after the war, and how that split set the stage for a global struggle that lasted nearly half a century. Stay with us, because understanding the beginning helps us understand everything that followed.
Yes, and as you listen, keep practicing your English. Try to repeat new words, write them down, and think about what they mean. This way, you'll learn history and language together. So, dear listeners, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's start uncovering the story of the long Cold War, one of the most fascinating and complex chapters in modern history.
When World War II ended in 1945, the world was in ruins. Cities were destroyed, millions of lives were lost, and entire nations were trying to recover. Yet, even in this moment of victory, a new conflict was already beginning to grow. The two strongest countries that had worked together to defeat Nazi Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union, suddenly became suspicious of each other. What started as a friendship built on necessity soon turned into a struggle for global power.
You're right, Adam. During the war, America and the Soviet Union fought on the same side. They were allies against a common enemy. But deep inside, they never fully trusted one another. Their systems were completely different. The United States believed in capitalism, where people had the freedom to own businesses and make personal choices. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, believed in communism, where the government controlled almost everything: the economy, the media, and even the daily lives of its citizens.
Yes, and those differences became clearer when the war ended. Europe was completely broken, and the question was, who would help rebuild it? The United States wanted a world based on democracy and open trade. America believed that when countries were free to choose their leaders and participate in a global economy, peace would naturally follow. But the Soviet Union had another idea. It wanted to spread communism and create a world where socialist governments would replace capitalist ones.
This disagreement became very visible at the major post-war meetings: the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference a few months later. These were moments when the leaders of the Allied powers, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, tried to decide how to shape the world after victory. At first, they agreed on some things, like dividing Germany into zones of occupation, but soon, tension began to rise. Each side wanted to secure its own influence over Europe.
At Yalta, they promised to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. But after the war, Stalin did not keep that promise. Instead, the Soviet Union began taking control of countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Communist governments were installed with the help of the Soviet Army, and soon these countries became part of what we call the Eastern Bloc. To the Americans and their Western allies, this looked like the beginning of Soviet expansion, a silent invasion using politics instead of weapons.
For Stalin, though, this move made perfect sense. The Soviet Union had been invaded twice in less than 30 years, first by Germany during World War I, and then again by Hitler's forces in World War II. Millions of Soviet citizens had died. So Stalin wanted a buffer zone of friendly communist states between his country and Western Europe to prevent another attack. But the United States saw this as aggression, not protection. It felt like communism was spreading too fast and threatening global freedom.
That's when mistrust became the center of the relationship between the two superpowers. The US didn't want to start another war, but it also didn't want the Soviets to dominate Europe. In 1947, the U.S. government created what became known as the Truman Doctrine, a policy that promised to help any country threatened by communism. It was America's way of saying, "We will stand against Soviet expansion." Soon after, the Marshall Plan was introduced, a massive program to rebuild Western Europe with American money and support.
The Marshall Plan wasn't just about economics. It was also a tool of diplomacy. By helping European countries recover quickly, the US hoped to prevent them from turning to communism. Factories reopened, food production increased, and people started to rebuild their lives. The plan was incredibly successful in Western Europe, but the Soviet Union saw it as a dangerous political move. Stalin refused to let Eastern European countries accept any American aid, saying it was an attempt by the US to control Europe through money.
So, Europe became divided, not by geography, but by ideology. On one side was the democratic and capitalist West, supported by the United States, and on the other side was the communist East, controlled by the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill later called this division the Iron Curtain, a term that perfectly described the invisible wall separating the two sides. It wasn't a real wall at first, but it represented the fear, secrecy, and hostility that would define the Cold War for decades.
This period was also the birth of something new, the idea of two superpowers competing for influence across the entire planet. The United States had unmatched economic power, advanced technology, and nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had a massive army, strict control over its people, and a strong belief in its political system. Both nations believed they were right, and both wanted to lead the world. This competition reached far beyond Europe, into Asia, Africa, and even Latin America.
Yes, and this global rivalry wasn't only about territory, it was also about proving which way of life was better. The US used movies, music, and advertising to promote freedom and individual success. The Soviet Union used education, art, and propaganda to show the strength of unity and equality. It was a battle of ideas, and both sides wanted to win the minds of people around the world. For many countries that were newly independent after colonialism, choosing a side became one of the biggest political decisions of their time.
And while the politicians were making their decisions, ordinary people were trying to understand what was happening. Many feared that another world war might break out, this time with nuclear weapons. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was still fresh. Everyone knew that if a new war started, it could destroy not just cities, but the entire planet. So even though the Cold War was cold, meaning there was no direct fighting between the US and the USSR, the fear was always hot in people's hearts.
That's what makes this part of history so complex. The Cold War wasn't only about weapons and politics. It was also about psychology. It was about fear, pride, and the human desire for safety and control. Both sides believed they were defending peace, yet both also prepared for war. Every move one country made was seen as a threat by the other. This constant suspicion became the defining feature of international relations for almost half a century.
So, as we can see, the end of World War II didn't bring the peace people hoped for. Instead, it opened the door to a new kind of struggle, one that would shape every generation afterward. It changed how governments acted, how scientists worked, and how people lived their daily lives. Even today, some of the global issues we face, from military alliances to nuclear talks, have roots in those early years of the Cold War.
You're absolutely right, Julia. Understanding this moment in history is essential for anyone studying international relations or global politics. It shows how quickly alliances can change when interests and ideologies clash. It reminds us that even after victory, peace can be fragile if trust is missing. And most importantly, it teaches us how communication and understanding can prevent history from repeating itself.
So, dear listeners, now that we know how this rivalry was born from the ashes of World War II, we can move forward to explore its deeper meaning. In our next section, we'll dive into the heart of the conflict, the battle of ideas between capitalism and communism. We'll explain what these systems mean, how they affected people's lives, and why they divided the world for so long.
Yes, stay with us as we continue to uncover this fascinating story. Remember, if you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what part of history interests you the most. Now that we understand how the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union began, it's time to explore what truly divided them, their ideologies. These weren't just political systems, they were two completely different ways of thinking about life, society, and human freedom. On one side stood capitalism, led by the United States. On the other stood communism, led by the Soviet Union. This ideological conflict shaped everything that happened during the Cold War.
Exactly, Adam. Let's start with capitalism. In a capitalist system, the economy is based on private ownership. This means people and businesses are free to make, buy, and sell goods. The government doesn't control everything. Instead, it lets the market decide what's needed through supply and demand. People can start their own companies, work for profit, and make personal choices about how to live. Supporters of capitalism believe that this freedom creates innovation, competition, and economic growth.
And that idea became a core part of the American identity. The United States presented itself as the land of opportunity, a place where anyone could succeed through hard work and creativity. Freedom of speech, democracy, and individual rights were seen as essential parts of that system. During the Cold War, America often used these ideas to show that its way of life was better and more humane than that of the Soviet Union.
But the Soviet Union saw things very differently. In communism, the goal was not personal wealth, but equality for all. The idea came from the writings of Karl Marx, who believed that history was shaped by class struggle, the fight between the rich and the poor. He imagined a world where there were no social classes, where everyone shared resources, and where the government made sure that wealth was distributed equally. The Soviet Union tried to turn that theory into reality.
Yes, and that's why in the Soviet system, the government controlled the economy, the factories, and even farms. There was no private business in the traditional sense. The state decided what to produce, how much to produce, and how much it would cost. In theory, this was supposed to make life fairer, so everyone had access to jobs, housing, and education. But in practice, it often led to shortages, inefficiency, and lack of personal freedom.
That's right. people in the Soviet Union didn't have the same freedom to express their opinions or criticize their leaders. The government controlled newspapers, radio, and television. Information was tightly managed to protect the image of the communist system. While education and science were highly developed, personal liberty was limited. On the other hand, in America, people enjoyed free speech, but there were also problems like inequality, unemployment, and racial discrimination.
It's interesting, Julia, because both sides believed they were defending what was right. The United States said it was protecting freedom and democracy, while the Soviet Union said it was defending equality and social justice. But this difference in belief created tension in every area of life: politics, education, economy, and even culture. It became a moral and psychological battle for the hearts and minds of the world's people.
Yes, and it's important to remember that this ideological conflict wasn't just between governments. It reached ordinary people too. Families in America were told that communism was dangerous, that it would take away their freedom and property. Meanwhile, families in the Soviet Union were taught that capitalism was greedy and unfair, making the rich richer and the poor poorer. This created fear and misunderstanding between the two societies.
And that fear grew stronger with every decade. In the United States, the late 1940s and early 1950s saw what became known as the Red Scare, a period when Americans were deeply afraid of communist influence inside their own country. Many people were accused of being spies or secret supporters of the Soviet Union. In Hollywood, schools, and the government, people were investigated simply because of their political opinions.
At the same time, in the Soviet Union, the government watched its citizens very closely. Anyone who spoke against communism could be punished or sent to prison. There were secret police forces that made sure people followed the state's rules. Fear and control were powerful tools for keeping society in order. It's sad to think that millions of people lived their daily lives under such tension, afraid to say the wrong thing or trust the wrong person.
That's one of the most human aspects of the Cold War. It wasn't only about leaders and weapons. It was about how fear can divide people who have never met each other. A child in New York and a child in Moscow grew up hearing that the other side was dangerous. They didn't know each other, but they both believed they were the good ones. It shows how powerful ideas and propaganda can be when used to shape public opinion.
And yet, both systems had some strengths. Under capitalism, innovation and technology grew rapidly. People were motivated to create new things, from cars to computers, because success brought reward. Under communism, there was a strong sense of community and equality in certain areas, like education and science. The Soviet Union produced great scientists, doctors, and astronauts. Both sides achieved impressive progress, but in completely different ways.
That's a good point. The competition between these two systems actually pushed the world forward in some areas. For example, the space race, which we'll discuss later, began because both countries wanted to prove that their system was superior. The same happened in sports, science, and education. Each side wanted to show that their way of life created better results for humanity. So even though it was a conflict, it also led to incredible human achievements. However, this ideological divide also created deep wounds. Many smaller countries were caught in between. They were pressured to choose a side, capitalism or communism. Some nations tried to stay neutral, forming the non-aligned movement, but most found it hard to avoid the global influence of either the United States or the Soviet Union. The world became a giant chessboard, and the superpowers were the players moving pieces around. And those pieces were often real countries with real people. From Eastern Europe to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Cold War became a global game of influence. Both superpowers supported allies with money, weapons, or propaganda. Sometimes, this competition led to conflict and suffering for the people caught in the middle. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism wasn't only political, it was emotional and deeply human.
Yes, and even though the Cold War ended decades ago, we can still see its impact today. Many countries still debate how much freedom or control a government should have. Questions about equality, democracy, and economic systems are still important in modern society. The story of capitalism and communism helps us understand why the world's political systems are so different, and why cooperation is still difficult in some regions.
So, dear listeners, now that we've explored the two competing ideologies that defined the Cold War, we're ready to move to the next part of our journey. In the next section, we'll look at how this ideological divide physically shaped the world, how Europe was split in two, how the Iron Curtain fell across the continent, and how the Berlin Wall became the ultimate symbol of a divided world.
Yes, that's going to be fascinating. We'll talk about how entire nations found themselves on one side or the other, and how ordinary people lived in a world divided not only by borders, but by beliefs. So stay tuned, dear listeners. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you've learned so far. We always love hearing from you.
Now that we've explored the ideological divide between capitalism and communism, let's focus on how this conflict physically shaped the world. After World War II, Europe was not only destroyed by fighting, but also divided by politics and power. Countries that had been allies suddenly found themselves choosing sides. On one side, there was the democratic capitalist West, supported by the United States. On the other, the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union.
Yes, Adam. This division became so visible that Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, called it the Iron Curtain. It wasn't a real curtain, of course, but a metaphor for the political, military, and ideological barrier that separated Eastern and Western Europe. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union controlled governments, limited freedoms, and influenced almost every aspect of life. Meanwhile, Western Europe was rebuilding under American support and democratic governance.
The Iron Curtain was more than a symbol. It was real in the way it affected people's lives. Families and friends were often separated by borders they could not cross. Travel and communication were restricted. Eastern Europeans lived under strict surveillance, and dissent against the government was punished. Western Europeans, on the other hand, experienced freedom of speech, trade, and political participation. The contrast between these two worlds was sharp and striking.
And the city of Berlin became the clearest example of this divide. The city was located deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but it was itself divided into East and West sectors. East Berlin was under Soviet control, while West Berlin was supported by the United States, Britain, and France. This made Berlin a unique place, a symbol of the Cold War. It was a city where two ideologies literally stood face to face, separated by walls, barbed wire, and constant tension.
Yes, the division of Berlin and Europe represented the larger global struggle. The Soviet Union wanted to secure its influence in Eastern Europe as a protective buffer. America and its allies wanted to ensure that democracy and capitalism could survive in Western Europe. This tension led to major events like the Berlin blockade in 1948, when the Soviet Union tried to cut off all supplies to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western allies out.
But the Western allies responded with the famous Berlin airlift. For almost a year, planes flew thousands of tons of food, fuel, and supplies to the people of West Berlin. It was a remarkable effort that showed determination, innovation, and cooperation. The airlift was more than just a logistics operation. It was a demonstration of the commitment of the United States and its allies to protect democracy and freedom, even in the heart of a communist-controlled region.
Exactly. And this division wasn't limited to Berlin. The Iron Curtain stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Adriatic Sea in the south. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were firmly under Soviet control. The West, meanwhile, worked to rebuild economically through initiatives like the Marshall Plan. This created two very different worlds, one where people experienced increasing wealth, freedom, and growth, and another where people lived under strict government control with limited personal choice.
And the separation was not only political or economic, it was psychological. Citizens on both sides were constantly reminded of the dangers of the other. Propaganda painted the opposing system as a threat. In Western Europe, children were taught that communism was dangerous and could destroy freedom. In the Eastern Bloc, citizens were taught that capitalism was unfair and created inequality. The Iron Curtain was a wall not only of borders but also of minds and beliefs.
It's also important to mention that the Iron Curtain created a lasting tension in international relations. Countries could no longer act independently without considering the superpowers. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 by the United States, Canada, and several Western European countries as a defensive alliance. Its purpose was to protect against Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, uniting Eastern Bloc nations under its military control.
This meant that every conflict, decision or movement in Europe had global significance. Even small countries had to think carefully about where they stood. The world had become bipolar, divided into two spheres of influence. Leaders knew that supporting the wrong side could have consequences for their nation's security, economy, and political stability. Ordinary people, meanwhile, felt the effects through restricted travel, censorship, and economic differences.
And despite these divisions, life went on. People worked, studied, and tried to live as normally as possible. Yet, behind the scenes, the threat of conflict was always present. Military forces were stationed across Europe, intelligence agencies gathered information, and both sides built up their arsenals. The Iron Curtain was not just a physical or political barrier. It was also a barrier to trust and understanding between nations, creating fear that could erupt into war at any moment.
That's why the division of Europe is one of the most important chapters in the Cold War. It shows us how ideology, power, and fear can separate people and nations. But it also reminds us how resilience, cooperation, and determination can overcome obstacles, as seen in events like the Berlin airlift. For English learners, this part of history is full of important vocabulary: alliance, occupation, blockade, surveillance, and propaganda. These words are still used in global discussions today.
Exactly. And understanding the Iron Curtain helps us understand the Cold War's impact on the rest of the world. The division of Europe influenced conflicts in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Countries that were rebuilding from colonialism or war often had to choose between Western capitalism or Soviet communism. These choices sometimes led to war, revolution, or political instability. The European division became a blueprint for the global struggle that lasted decades.
So, dear listeners, as we continue this story, remember that the Iron Curtain was more than a line on a map. It was a symbol of fear, mistrust, and the power of ideas. It shaped lives, nations, and history itself. In the next section, we'll explore one of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War: the nuclear arms race and the constant fear of global destruction. We'll explain how both superpowers developed weapons that could destroy the entire world and how this affected everyday life.
Now that we've seen how Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, let's talk about one of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War: the nuclear arms race. After World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that the next global conflict could involve weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. This created a climate of fear unlike anything the world had seen before.
Yes, Adam. The United States had already used nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, showing their destructive power. The Soviet Union, determined not to be left behind, quickly began developing its own nuclear program. By 1949, the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb. Suddenly, the balance of power was uncertain, and both countries had the potential to destroy each other and much of the world in an instant.
This led to the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Simply put, if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would respond in kind, resulting in total devastation for both. Neither superpower wanted to start a nuclear war because it would mean almost certain annihilation. Yet, the fear of the other side attacking first made both countries build massive arsenals of weapons, missiles, and delivery systems.
And this fear wasn't just for governments, it affected ordinary people too. In the United States and other Western countries, children practiced duck and cover drills at school, hiding under desks to prepare for a nuclear attack. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards, and governments distributed pamphlets explaining what to do if a nuclear strike occurred. The idea of sudden destruction became part of everyday life.
At the same time, the Soviet Union also prepared its citizens for a possible nuclear war. The government controlled information about the weapons, but people knew that America had them, and that fear was constant. Life under the threat of atomic bombs created tension, anxiety, and even paranoia. Families, schools, and communities were forced to live with the possibility that their lives could end at any moment.
The arms race also pushed both countries to innovate rapidly. New types of bombs were created, from hydrogen bombs to long-range missiles capable of traveling thousands of kilometers. Both superpowers spent enormous amounts of money and resources to stay ahead. Every technological achievement was seen as a demonstration of power, not just progress. The space race, which came later, was part of this same competition to show superiority.
Yes, and even though they never used these weapons in battle, the threat influenced international relations in dramatic ways. Every crisis, every disagreement, and every political move had to consider the possibility of nuclear war. Leaders were under constant pressure to make careful decisions, knowing that a single mistake could have global consequences. The Cold War was dangerous not because of actual fighting between superpowers, but because of the potential for complete destruction.
And ordinary citizens experienced this tension every day. People followed the news carefully, worried about events like the Korean War, the Cuban Revolution, or the building of missile sites in foreign countries. Propaganda reinforced the idea that the enemy was preparing for an attack. Governments used this fear to maintain control and justify military spending. The arms race became both a political tool and a psychological weapon.
The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is one of the clearest examples of how close the world came to nuclear war. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. For 13 tense days, the world waited, uncertain whether diplomacy or disaster would prevail. Both superpowers were aware that any misstep could trigger a full-scale nuclear conflict, yet leaders managed to negotiate and avoid catastrophe.
This crisis showed how the nuclear race created constant tension, even without actual fighting. The fear of mutual destruction kept both sides cautious. It also showed the importance of diplomacy, communication, and negotiation. For citizens, however, living under the threat of nuclear war for decades created anxiety, uncertainty, and a sense that the world could change in an instant.
The nuclear race wasn't only about bombs, it also drove innovation in science and technology. Missile systems, radar, satellites, and early warning systems were developed to maintain security. The competition led to achievements that shaped the modern world, such as space exploration, nuclear energy, and global communication networks. In a strange way, fear accelerated scientific progress, even though it was motivated by rivalry.
Yes, but it's also a lesson about the dangers of unchecked competition. The arms race cost billions of dollars, created fear, and put humanity at risk. It reminds us that power without responsibility can threaten everyone, not just leaders. The Cold War shows that human decisions, ideologies, and ambitions can affect the entire planet, making history a shared story of risk and caution.
For English learners, this period offers valuable vocabulary. Words like arsenal, missile, deterrence, paranoia, and catastrophe, which are still used today in political discussions and news reports. Listening to history in simple English helps learners understand complex ideas while improving their comprehension and speaking skills.
Exactly. And it also reminds us why studying history is important. Understanding the nuclear race helps us understand the psychology, technology, and diplomacy of the Cold War. It teaches us how fear and mistrust can escalate tensions, but also how careful negotiation and communication can prevent disaster. These lessons are relevant even today, in a world where technological advances bring both opportunity and risk.
So, dear listeners, now that we understand the dangers of the nuclear arms race and the constant fear of destruction, we're ready to explore the conflicts that actually happened during the Cold War, the proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and other parts of the world. In the next section, we'll see how the superpowers fought indirectly, influencing the lives of millions without ever directly engaging each other in war.
Yes, and remember, if you're enjoying this story, please like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and leave a comment telling us your thoughts about the nuclear race and how it affected ordinary people. We love hearing from you and knowing where you are listening from, so keep sharing your experiences as we continue this journey through the Cold War.
After the nuclear race established fear and tension, the Cold War began to spread through actual conflicts around the world. The superpowers rarely fought each other directly, but they often engaged in what are called proxy wars. These were battles where one side supported a local government or group, and the other side backed the opposing faction. The first major example was the Korean War in the early 1950s.
Yes, Adam. Korea had been divided into two parts after World War II. The northern part, supported by the Soviet Union, became communist under Kim Il-sung, while the southern part, supported by the United States, became a democratic republic under Syngman Rhee. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, hoping to reunify the country under communism. This triggered a major conflict that drew in both superpowers indirectly.
The United States, under the United Nations, sent troops to support South Korea. Meanwhile, China, with encouragement from the Soviet Union, sent forces to aid the North. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed or displaced. The war lasted 3 years and ended with a stalemate, leaving Korea divided at the 38th parallel, much like it is today. This conflict showed that the Cold War wasn't just a political struggle. It had real, devastating effects on ordinary people.
Exactly. And the Korean War set the stage for other conflicts, especially in Southeast Asia. Vietnam became the next major focus. After the French left Vietnam in the 1950s, the country was divided between the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-Communist South, backed by the United States. The Vietnam War escalated in the 1960s, as America tried to prevent communism from spreading further in Asia.
The Vietnam War was long and brutal. American troops faced guerrilla fighters in dense jungles, while the North Vietnamese were supported by the Soviet Union and China. Millions of people died, and cities were destroyed. It became a conflict not only between nations, but also an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. The war deeply divided American society, as protests against it grew, showing that Cold War conflicts affected not only the countries involved, but also the superpowers themselves.
Other regions were affected too. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, newly independent countries faced pressure to choose sides. The United States and the Soviet Union provided military aid, training, and political advice to governments aligned with their ideologies. Some nations became battlegrounds for influence without direct invasion. The Cold War was truly global, affecting economies, politics, and even daily life in countries far from Europe or America.
And these proxy wars were dangerous because they often created long-lasting instability. In some cases, civil wars were prolonged because the superpowers provided resources to both sides. Families lived in fear, communities were divided, and generations grew up in countries where foreign influence determined political decisions. The Cold War's reach extended far beyond diplomacy or rhetoric. It shaped the lives of millions around the world.
Another important aspect was the role of ideology. In Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts, each side wanted to prove that its political system worked. Capitalism and democracy were promoted as systems of freedom and opportunity. Communism, on the other hand, was promoted as a system of equality and social justice. Both sides used these ideas to justify their actions, claiming that they were protecting the future of humanity.
Yes, Julia. And the media played a key role too. Television, newspapers, and radio reported on battles, casualties, and political statements. Citizens around the world could follow events in real time. This created pressure on governments to act carefully, while also shaping public opinion. People became aware that these proxy wars were part of a much larger global struggle, a competition not only of armies, but of ideas, propaganda, and influence.
The Cold War also fueled an arms race beyond nuclear weapons. Both sides supplied conventional weapons, tanks, planes, and ships to their allies. Intelligence agencies became more active, conducting espionage, sabotage, and covert operations. Organizations like the CIA in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union expanded their power. The superpowers were competing in every field: military, technology, diplomacy, and even culture.
Culture was indeed a battlefield. The United States promoted movies, music, and fashion to show the benefits of capitalist society. The Soviet Union highlighted literature, art, and science to demonstrate the strengths of communism. Sports competitions, space achievements, and technological milestones were often portrayed as proof that one system was superior. This soft power influenced millions of people who never experienced direct conflict but were part of the ideological struggle.
And yet, while these proxy wars were destructive, they never escalated into a full-scale war between the superpowers. Both nations understood the dangers of nuclear weapons. The threat of total destruction created a strange kind of balance. Neither side wanted to attack the other directly. This balance of fear, diplomacy, and indirect conflict defined the Cold War for decades, showing that global power could be contested without direct confrontation.
Exactly. And the impact of these conflicts is still visible today. Many countries that were involved in Cold War proxy wars continue to deal with political instability, economic challenges, and social divisions. Understanding these wars helps us see the global consequences of superpower competition and the human cost of ideological struggles.
For English learners, this section is full of useful words and phrases: proxy war, stalemate, guerrilla fighters, insurgency, ideology, and influence. Learning these terms helps students understand not only history, but also current events, as international relations still rely on similar ideas of alliances, strategy, and global influence.
So, as we move forward, we'll explore how the Cold War influenced diplomacy, alliances, and global negotiations. We'll also discuss moments of hope, where leaders worked to reduce tension and prevent conflict, showing that even during the Cold War, negotiation and dialogue were essential to maintaining peace.
Yes, this is a reminder that history is not just about war, but also about the decisions, compromises, and courage of people trying to navigate a dangerous world. Understanding these conflicts helps us see why diplomacy matters, why human lives are affected by political struggles, and how learning from history can guide our choices today.
Even though the Cold War was filled with tension, fear, and proxy wars, diplomacy and negotiations played a critical role in preventing full-scale global conflict. Leaders realized that unchecked rivalry could lead to disaster. This awareness led to several important treaties and agreements designed to reduce tension and create stability between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Exactly, Adam. One of the first major diplomatic efforts was the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, in the 1970s. These negotiations focused on limiting the number of nuclear weapons held by each side. Both superpowers realized that reducing nuclear stockpiles was essential to prevent accidental war. The treaties established limits, verification processes, and communication channels to avoid misunderstandings that could escalate into conflict.
Another important agreement was the Helsinki Accords of 1975. This was not a treaty about weapons, but about political cooperation, human rights, and economic collaboration. Leaders from 35 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, agreed to respect borders, promote trade, and ensure fundamental human rights. While it did not end the Cold War, it created a framework for dialogue and encouraged nations to focus on cooperation instead of confrontation.
Yes, diplomacy was not always easy. There were setbacks, miscommunications, and renewed tension after events like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Yet, each negotiation, summit, and agreement showed that dialogue was possible even during intense rivalry. Diplomats worked behind the scenes for years to reduce the risk of war, proving that careful communication could counteract fear and hostility.
One of the most famous moments of diplomacy was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Although we discussed it in the nuclear race section, it's also an example of negotiation preventing disaster. Both John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev communicated carefully to reach a compromise. The crisis demonstrated the importance of back-channel diplomacy, clear communication, and patience, showing the world how easily misunderstandings could escalate into catastrophe.
Yes, and treaties like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987 further reduced tension. This agreement required both sides to eliminate certain classes of missiles and allowed inspections to ensure compliance. These steps were monumental because they were not just about reducing weapons, but also about rebuilding trust after decades of suspicion. The Cold War was not only a battle of arms, but a battle of confidence between nations.
Diplomacy also included summits and meetings between leaders, where they discussed arms control, trade, and regional conflicts. For example, Reagan and Gorbachev held several meetings that paved the way for major reductions in nuclear arsenals. These negotiations showed that dialogue and compromise could be more powerful than confrontation. Leaders gradually learned that maintaining peace required constant effort, patience, and strategic thinking.
At the same time, these diplomatic efforts had a social impact. Citizens in both superpowers saw that conflict could be managed without war. International organizations, educational exchanges, and cultural programs helped promote understanding. Music, art, and sports events were also used to bridge divides, showing that diplomacy extended beyond politics and into the lives of ordinary people.
Yes, and for students of history, these examples show how negotiation, compromise, and communication can prevent disaster even during tense rivalries. Learning about these treaties helps us understand that war is not inevitable and that careful planning and dialogue are essential for global peace. Diplomacy was a tool that kept the Cold War cold, rather than allowing it to become a hot, destructive war.
It's also important to note that not all diplomatic efforts succeeded immediately. Some treaties were violated, negotiations broke down, and mistrust remained. Yet, even these challenges provided lessons in patience, strategy, and the importance of international norms. For English learners, terms like arms limitation, verification, summit, negotiation, and diplomatic channels are essential vocabulary to understand global politics.
Exactly. The Cold War teaches us that fear and suspicion can be countered with careful strategy and communication. While weapons, ideology, and competition were dominant forces, diplomacy demonstrated that leaders could influence history without resorting to violence. The agreements, treaties, and summits created a framework for future peace and showed the world the importance of negotiation in maintaining stability.
And these lessons are still relevant today. Understanding Cold War diplomacy helps us interpret modern international relations, where trust, dialogue, and compromise continue to be essential. The balance between competition and cooperation, between defense and negotiation, remains a central challenge for nations, demonstrating that history continues to shape our world.
So, dear listeners, diplomacy reminds us that even in periods of extreme tension, dialogue can prevent destruction, build trust, and create opportunities for cooperation. In our next section, we'll explore how the Cold War affected culture, education, and daily life around the world, showing that the rivalry was not only political or military, but also social and human. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was beginning to show serious signs of weakness. Economically, the country was struggling, and its people were increasingly dissatisfied with shortages, limited freedoms, and a lack of opportunity. Politically, the rigid structure of the Communist Party was unable to adapt to the changing world. It was during this period that a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power, bringing ideas of reform that would change the course of history.
Yes, Adam. Gorbachev introduced two major policies: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost allowed more freedom of speech, access to information, and discussion of social and political issues. Perestroika aimed to reform the economy, introducing limited market mechanisms and encouraging efficiency. These reforms were intended to modernize the Soviet system, but they also unleashed forces for change that the government could not fully control.
People began to openly discuss the problems in their country: economic shortages, corruption, and political repression. Citizens expressed their opinions in newspapers, books, and public meetings. The Soviet government could no longer fully suppress dissent, and movements for independence grew in various republics within the Union. The Baltic states, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, pushed for autonomy, inspiring others across the Soviet Union to demand change.
At the same time, Gorbachev worked to reduce tensions with the West. He signed arms reduction agreements with the United States, withdrew troops from Afghanistan, and improved diplomatic relations. These moves demonstrated that the Cold War could end through negotiation and cooperation, rather than confrontation. The Soviet Union's external relations were improving, but internally, the reforms were creating instability and accelerating demands for political freedom.
One of the most visible symbols of this change was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. For decades, the wall had divided East and West Berlin, separating families, communities, and ideologies. With the weakening of Soviet control, East Germans demanded the right to travel freely, and the government could no longer maintain strict restrictions. On November 9, 1989, the wall was opened, allowing people to cross freely for the first time in decades.
The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a physical event. It was a powerful symbol of the end of the Cold War. It showed that decades of strict control, fear, and ideological division could be overcome by the desire for freedom and change. The event inspired similar movements across Eastern Europe, leading to the collapse of communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania.
In the following years, the Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate. Republics declared independence, and political authority in Moscow weakened. By 1991, the union of multiple republics that had existed since 1922 officially dissolved. Gorbachev resigned as president, and Boris Yeltsin became the leader of the Russian Federation. This moment marked the official end of the Cold War, ending decades of ideological tension and rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union.
The end of the Cold War brought hope and uncertainty. Economically, countries transitioned to new systems. Politically, nations experimented with democracy and new governance structures. Socially, people who had lived under strict control experienced newfound freedoms. The collapse also shifted global power, with the United States emerging as the sole superpower for the first time in decades, reshaping international relations in the 1990s and beyond.
For ordinary citizens, these changes were dramatic. Families who had been separated by borders could reunite. Travel became easier, and cultural exchanges flourished. Yet, economic instability in former Soviet republics created hardships for many. The end of the Cold War was both a time of celebration and a period of adaptation, showing that political change affects not only governments, but also the lives of millions of people.
Historically, the fall of the Soviet Union teaches us about the power of reform, dialogue, and the desire for freedom. Gorbachev's policies, though controversial at the time, demonstrated that even large, rigid systems can be transformed. The peaceful resolution of such a prolonged period of tension highlights the importance of negotiation, compromise, and vision in international relations.
For English learners, this section offers useful vocabulary: reform, openness, restructuring, independence, disintegration, and freedom. Understanding these terms in historical context helps learners improve comprehension while connecting language to real-world events. These words are still relevant today in discussions about politics, governance, and human rights.
The end of the Cold War was a turning point in global history. It demonstrated that decades of rivalry, fear, and ideological conflict could conclude without direct world war. While the world continued to face challenges, the collapse of the Soviet Union created new opportunities for cooperation, dialogue, and progress, illustrating that change, though difficult, is always possible.
In the next and final section, we will reflect on the lessons of the Cold War, how it shaped modern history, influenced international relations, and what we can learn today about power, diplomacy, and human resilience. This reflection will help us understand why studying the Cold War is not only about the past, but also about preparing for the future. As we reach the end of our discussion, it's important to reflect on what the Cold War teaches us. For decades, the world lived under the shadow of fear, division, and ideological rivalry. People endured shortages, propaganda, and constant tension, while governments competed for power and influence. Yet, despite the dangers, humanity found ways to adapt, innovate, and survive. The Cold War is a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but also by ordinary people.
Absolutely, Adam. We've seen that diplomacy, communication, and negotiation were crucial in preventing full-scale war. Treaties like SALT, the Helsinki Accords, and the INF Treaty showed that even during intense rivalry, careful planning and dialogue could maintain global stability. Leaders learned that fear alone could not govern nations, and that compromise and understanding were essential for peace. These lessons are valuable not only for historians, but for everyone who wants to understand how the world functions today.
Another important lesson is the human side of history. From families living under strict control in the Soviet Union to communities navigating fear in the United States, ordinary people experienced the Cold War in ways that textbooks often overlook. Dreams, hopes, and daily struggles existed alongside politics and ideology. By studying these personal stories, we understand that history is lived, not only written, and that human resilience can persist even in the most challenging circumstances.
Yes, and the Cold War also illustrates the consequences of ideological conflict. The competition between capitalism and communism drove technological innovation, space exploration, and economic growth. But it also led to proxy wars, fear, and social division. Understanding these dynamics helps us see that global politics are complex, involving both opportunity and risk, and that decisions by leaders affect millions of lives in profound ways.
For English learners, this section is full of meaningful vocabulary: resilience, diplomacy, compromise, rivalry, adaptation, and ideology. Listening to history in simple English helps learners connect language to events, improving comprehension and speaking skills. History becomes more than memorization. It becomes a story that teaches critical thinking, empathy, and cultural awareness.
Looking back, the Cold War also teaches us about the importance of responsibility. The nuclear arms race reminded leaders that unchecked ambition can endanger the entire world. Proxy wars showed that conflicts far from superpower capitals can have devastating local impacts. And the eventual fall of the Soviet Union demonstrated that reform, openness, and dialogue can overcome long-standing divisions and create new opportunities for peace.
We also see that history is a cycle of challenges and solutions. Each era of tension encourages innovation, reflection, and learning. The Cold War may be over, but the lessons remain relevant. Dialogue prevents conflict. Human resilience endures under pressure, and cooperation is often more powerful than confrontation. These insights are essential for students, leaders, and citizens who want to understand the modern world.
Finally, studying the Cold War reminds us that understanding history empowers us to shape the future. Recognizing the consequences of fear, mistrust, and ideological rigidity helps societies avoid repeating mistakes. Likewise, understanding the successes of diplomacy, reform, and negotiation encourages approaches that prioritize human well-being over political rivalry. History becomes a guide for building a more peaceful and informed world.
So, dear listeners, as we conclude, we hope this journey through the Cold War has helped you understand not only the events and leaders, but also the human experiences, lessons, and vocabulary embedded in history. Learning from the past allows us to engage with the present more thoughtfully and prepares us to face future challenges with knowledge and empathy.
Thank you for joining us on this long journey through one of the most complex periods in modern history. The Cold War may have ended decades ago, but its lessons about diplomacy, human resilience, and global responsibility remain deeply relevant today. Keep exploring, questioning, and learning, because understanding the past is the key to shaping a better future for all of us.
And with that, we conclude our exploration of the Cold War. Remember, history is not just dates and events. It is the story of people, ideas, and choices. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep learning.